I can just like cruise on through now. What is even going on here? Why would my character be so, dressed to the nines and perfectly shaven if he is having a bad time, and that's clear. If a person really feels like in order to engage a game or over time starts to feel like they are highly identified with their character, there has probably been some kind of adaptive meaning making.
So it's like you can also make it about aesthetics, right? Because if you say this very punk person created like a warlock character that fit his, well, aesthetics of being against the establishment, would you argue that features like the growing hair and beard in games like Witcher 3 or Red Dead Redemption 2 are important to foster avatars-me relationships? Because you can't really customize the characters, but you can customize in some way how they look by either being really well groomed with a trimmed beard and a nice shirt, or you can like wear furs and have a full beard and stuff.
I think it could go either way, right? Because it could be that the control that you have over the character itself fosters a feeling of identification through control, right? As is evident in some of the literature. But it could also sort of provoke this sense of it being something else. Let's think about the fact that if I was playing the main Red Dead character, I don't grow facial hair that I normally have to manage, right? And so the idea of trying to make decisions about facial hair may increase the distance, the psychological distance between me and that character. But there could be some possibility that if I'm playing a male character and I start to engage in some kind of, I don't know, I might see it in the old character attachment literature. It was sort of like this sense of responsibility over the character, and that's a form of identification. It could start to look like that, right? Whoa, it's my job to make sure that this character stays well groomed, right? For me, the harder time the character is having, the more scruffy I want them to be, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean identification. That's more like critical concern, right? Why would my character be so, dressed to the nines and perfectly shaven if he is having a bad time, and that's clear, right?
Yeah. That's also really interesting because I didn't think of like the beard of being a problem, because it's natural for me growing a beard. So yeah, I didn't think this through from a perspective of a non-beard wearer.
There you go.
But what's also really interesting is what you just said about critical concern, as how the character should look or should feel in comparison to the situation they're in to make it believable. And because let's jump to the question about critical concern in Witcher 3 I have made up. You usually play Geralt of Rivia in Witcher 3, and he's like this scar-faced, scruffy character that's fitting to the game world. But there's also passages of the game where you play Cyrilla, and she feels very different to him, because you actually play her in a pretty harsh time of her life where she's like lost and she's trying to figure out how to run away from the wild hunt and stuff. But she's also very overpowered, because in the passages where you play her, you can like jump and you can run really fast and you can teleport and you can manipulate time and whatever. And I always found myself skipping through these parts of the game, like rushing through, skipping enemies, running through levels, skipping dialogue, because it doesn't really speak to me in the way that playing Geralt does in this world. So would you argue that like having these passages of the game can actually destroy the amount of critical concern, or can it actually be helpful to the game's experience that you have characters that feel different?
This is a tricky question. I have so many different disconnected thoughts on it. And I think that this would actually make an amazing investigation. My more immediate experience with this was, last night in Cyberpunk. There's this part where you do exactly what you just said, and you switch to this really powerful character, but it feels disruptive until it doesn't feel disruptive, because in that instance, it's playing very heavily into the narrative arc of the entire game, right? And so in that way, well, you're like, what is even going on here, right? And then you realize that it's in the service of some greater story. And so I guess that makes me want to suggest it may be disruptive or not, depending on how the shift is framed. So that's from the narrative side of things, right? But from the ludic side of things, I could expect that's probably a little crazy, because you're like, oh, I'm having a hard time battling through all these mobs. And then you're like, whoa, I just blew away that guy with one shot. I'll tell you, for me, it was a little bit of a relief. It was like, oh, I can just like cruise on through now. This is all right. I can get used to this. It might become boring after a period of time, but also, you know, it's like this nice little interlude. And I think in this kind of question, part of what likely matters is your motivations for playing, right? I'm a narrative player. So for me, as long as you're framing the shift in a way that makes sense narratively, I'm cool with it. But watching Nick play through last night in this exact scene where you shift over, and he's very much this, like, so if we think about it from entertainment theory, I seek appreciation, he seeks enjoyment. And so it's a different kind of experience of the same event. So I would say it depends on how the shift is framed narratively and ludically, but also what are we seeking to get out of it as far as, is it a problem or not?
Okay, so I want to say, first of all, you are probably very right about the thing you said about what we want to get out of the gaming experience, because when I played through Witcher the first time, I was playing through it for the story, and I was playing through it on a lower difficult mode, and I didn't hate this part of the game as much. And the second time I was just playing through it to get the achievements, and I was struggling because everything was one-shotting me, and yeah, that's probably why I didn't enjoy this part of the game. Okay. Let's see if we still have some questions left that we haven't talked about yet. You talked about the avatar-symbiote relationship types in the text, giving the players the opportunity to create and be a persona with different features. Do you think with modern games and their possibilities for avatars to become more multifaceted, these type of relationships will increase even further? Like, for example, in Assassin's Creed, where you can choose to play either a male or female character and also have romances with either male or female characters.
I think that's a possibility. The thing about symbiotes, who are, to me, the most interesting category of relationships, is that they tend to be very personal, but very utilitarian. People are often engaging these characters in the course of solving some sort of problem. For instance, a number of battered women, where they are engaging their character as something that perhaps looks like them or feels like them, but has enough distinct traits that they desire, that they want to sometimes practice being. These women would often create very powerful characters, very sexy characters, in the sort of with the goal of practicing being powerful as they try to reclaim their own power, either after leaving a relationship or in order to leave a relationship. There was one individual identifying as genderqueer and basically used it to play different bodies to figure out what body was most comfortable. It's sort of this, there's a gap between who I am and who I want to be. And they use the character in that space to try to solve whatever they see as their problem. So to the extent that different types of affordances of games help people to find ways to fill those gaps, most certainly. And I think that if there are more tools, there's more opportunities to fill the gaps. The challenging part of answering this question is that the gap is different for everybody. So it will be, it's probably somewhere in between what the game offers and how they have figured out how to use what the game offers.
So the avatar as symbiotes, or these symbiote characters, are like symbiotes in a very literal way. They really make up for a possibility to experience some things we are not able to experience in real life. But that sounds as if it would really correlate with maybe wishful identification. What you just said about people experimenting who they want to be in the world, or which character actually fits them the most, or like people creating really powerful characters in order to maybe feel powerful in real life as well. Can this actually have an impact on how they feel in real life? Like, for example, if someone who feels like more weak, or like a smaller type of person, like body-wise, if they play like a character like Kratos from God of War, will they feel more powerful in real life as well? So will the in-game experience have an effect on the experience of real life?
So from the stories that I have heard from players, definitely, as in that, and most of them are in that symbiote zone. But there's another way that this is possible, and if you're interested in this idea, you should look into the work on the Proteus effect. And Proteus effect is really where I see it as more of like a priming effect, to where we will engage a character. The character has certain attributes. The attributes are tied in our minds to different types of scripts or like behaviors, right? Ways of acting. And when they get primed, then we more often will take them up. For instance, it might be that taller people are more outgoing. Well, those things aren't necessarily always connected, but we may have an idea in our head that taller people are more assertive and outgoing. And so when we get assigned a tall character versus a small character, we will be more outgoing in our interactions. But they've kind of done this across a bunch of different types of like stereotypes. Tall people wearing white versus wearing black in terms of behaving prosocially, if I remember correctly. But the main idea is that by assigning someone a character that has a particular attribute that we tend to associate with certain behaviors, we will be more likely to actually take up those behaviors.
It's a really good answer. And it also brings me to another point. Do you think that maybe value homophily would increase this process of us adapting traits from a character that we wish to identify with?
That is an interesting question, and I don't know.
Okay, that
would be a fun study.
Okay, I think we're actually through with the main questions. Okay, we have one short question that we haven't talked about, and this is that your work states that the avatar as other relationship is the most social one. And why is that so?
So we can think about it. Remember, I talked about how it's operationally social, that all player avatar relationships are operationally social.
Yeah.
I give information, they give information back to me. I react to it based on those first two terms. It's interactive. And building on that, the avatar as other is a sort of more heuristic orientation toward the character, where you see them as human-like and existing in their own right in some capacity, right? That you have less control over them, so they have a certain amount of their own agency or autonomy, right? You tend to be concerned that they will fit into the world in a way that makes sense for a social agent, right? So you are seeing them more in line with the notion of sociality, right? That is, that you are exchanging in meaning-making activities as you move through the game together as gameplay companions.
But isn't this also the case for avatar symbiote characters?
It can be, right? Because remember, symbiotes are sort of, there's two kind of variations on symbiotes as they sit between me and other. So they can be a type of relationship that flips back and forth, right, between me and other, or one that sort of looks more like this, where they are blending together or experiencing the blending together of parts of themselves and parts of the avatar as an other. So there certainly can be some of that wrapped up in the experiences of avatar symbiote relations.
Okay, but you would argue that the avatar as other relationship type is still more social, since the avatar symbiote kind of branches into like the avatar as me relationship type.
Yes, and really what's important to think about is that these relationships, as we go from object to me to symbiote to other, are sitting along a loose continuum of self-differentiation.
Yeah.
And so the most differentiated, right, is the other, as they are a completely separate entity in your experience. Whereas the symbiotes are less social in the sort of experiential, the subjective sense, because there's still this enmeshment. It's more like interdependence, or maybe even codependence of some kind, than it is about like independent companionship.
Yeah. Okay, then I think we're actually through with all the main questions, but we still have some finishing questions for you.
Mhm.
And the first one of these finishing questions is, since the focus of your research has shifted away from video games, what is one particular subject in the environment of player avatar identification and interaction that you personally would like to see more research on?
As I have moved more into the human machine, like social machine relation area, primarily with robots, but a little bit with like bots and human perceptions of AI, I would love to see some integration of how some of the autonomous features of characters may be playing a role in the player avatar relation. For instance, many characters will sort of, when you're not moving them around, they'll go side to side. Or if we even think about classic Sonic, when he taps his foot when you ignore him for too long, right? Those things are part of what gives characters animacy. How are these types of character AI components playing a role in the player-character connection? Not just for avatars alone, but also for NPCs, and how the engagement of characters and NPCs may be affected and may actually influence our perceived sociality of our own characters based on how they connect with other agents in the game.
Maybe this makes up for future research projects or master thesis. There's this one question that I haven't written down, and that is, would you say the characters in Assassin's Creed, in the series Assassin's Creed, are persistent characters or persistent avatars? Because you play somewhat different characters from different times, but they all are connected through the animus, and they all are connected by like this meta story, and they all somewhat feel and play the same across all the games. So would you argue that this is some sort of persistent avatar or persistent character, or are these individual characters in your opinion?
So I would suggest that so long as there is person perception that carries across the games, then they're the same character. If a player can experience them in the same way, as connected together through some kind of arc, which I think the franchise has done a pretty good job of making that the world of many worlds and times sort of cohesive. I might suggest that helps with at least the perception of persistence.
Okay, that answers the question. Thank you very much. We're coming up to 2 hours of interview right now, so I think it's time to wrap up the interview part with the predefined questions.
Sure.
Thank you for the opportunity of this interview about the player avatar identification, relationships, and interactions. And it was very interesting, and there were a lot more points that I would have thought about beforehand, but still I'm very happy that our questions somewhat fit the topic or the narrative of your text.
Indeed. Thank you. No, now I want to go back and do more work on this stuff now.
Well, maybe you can and you will in the future. That's probably up to you.
It will always be a special place in my heart. So we published just recently on player mental models for avatars. So I'm still doing it a little bit. We'll see how it goes.